In May 1945, an American Army cameraman captured something that would haunt viewers for decades. A young woman walking down a road in Czechoslovakia. Her face was swollen from being beaten. Her eyes held 1,000-yard stare. She moved like a ghost among surrendering German soldiers. This brief, 55-second piece of color footage would become one of the most powerful images of World War II's end. The woman had no name, no story that anyone knew. She became known simply as the lost German girl. Who was she? What happened to her? And why does her image still move people to tears today? This is her story, a story that reminds us that war's greatest victims are often those we never hear about. Her real name was Lore Bauer. Born on February 3, 1921, in the small Austrian town of Kollerschlag. She was just an ordinary girl who grew up in extraordinary times. Austria had become part of Nazi Germany when she was 17. Her childhood disappeared as her country was swallowed by war. Like millions of young Germans and Austrians, Lore found herself pulled into the war machine. But she wasn't a soldier. She was something called a Luftwaffenhelferin, an Air Force helper. As German men died on battlefields across Europe, women and teenagers were called to defend the homeland. Lore was assigned to operate anti-aircraft guns. Imagine that. A young woman from a quiet Austrian village, now pointing massive guns at the sky, trying to shoot down Allied bombers. This was the reality for countless young people in Nazi Germany's final desperate years. By 1945, the Nazi Empire was crumbling. The Soviets were advancing from the east, the Americans and British from the west. Cities were burning. Millions of people were fleeing. The world Lore had known was ending in chaos and terror. She was stationed in Czechoslovakia when everything fell apart. The unit she served with was scattered. Communications broke down. Orders stopped coming. Young women like Lore, who had been trained to fight, now found themselves alone in a collapsing world. The roads were filled with refugees. German civilians fleeing the advancing Red Army, soldiers deserting their posts, and displaced people from across Europe all trying to survive. Everyone had heard the stories of what happened when the Soviets arrived. For German women especially, the fear was overwhelming. Lore joined the streams of people heading west, hoping to reach American or British lines instead of falling into Soviet hands. She carried whatever she could and walked with thousands of others toward an uncertain future. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war was officially over, but for people like Lore, the nightmare was just beginning. She found herself on a road about 78 kilometers from Prague, walking with a group of German soldiers who had decided to surrender to the Americans. But something terrible had happened to her. The footage shows her face swollen and bruised. Her clothes were torn. She appeared to be in shock, moving mechanically, staring ahead with empty eyes. What had she endured in those final days of the war? We can only imagine. Perhaps she had been assaulted by advancing troops. Maybe she had been beaten by angry civilians seeking revenge on any German they could find. Or possibly she had been attacked by desperate deserters or refugees fighting for food and shelter. The brutality of war's end was often worse than the war itself. Law and order had broken down. People were capable of anything. For a young German woman alone on the roads, the dangers were unthinkable. Captain Orrin Haglund was a United States Army Air Force cameraman. His job was to document the final days of the war in Europe. He was near Plzeň, Czechoslovakia, when he encountered this group of surrendering Germans. Haglund had filmed countless scenes of war, destroyed cities, prisoner columns, military operations. But something about this young woman caught his attention. Maybe it was her youth, or the obvious trauma she had suffered, or simply the way she embodied the human cost of the conflict. He filmed her for less than a minute. She walks slowly past the camera, her face a mask of shock and exhaustion. She doesn't look at the camera or acknowledge its presence. She seems to exist in her own world of trauma and survival. Haglund couldn't have known that this brief footage would become one of the most powerful and haunting images of World War II. He was just doing his job, documenting history as it happened, but he had captured something profound: the face of war's innocent victims. For decades, the identity of the lost German girl remained a mystery. The footage appeared in the famous BBC documentary series, The World at War. and millions of viewers were moved by the brief, haunting image. But nobody knew who she was. Internet forums buzzed with theories and research attempts. Historians and amateur detectives tried to identify her. Some claimed she was an SS helper trying to hide her identity. Others suggested she was simply a civilian, caught in the chaos of war's end. The mystery deepened the impact of the footage. She represented all the unknown victims of war, the people whose names we never learn, whose stories are never told, but who suffered just as much as any famous historical figure. Without a name or a story, she became a symbol. The lost German girl represented the millions of displaced persons, the countless women who suffered sexual violence in war, the young people whose lives were destroyed by decisions made by old men in distant capitals. Finally, in 2014, researchers made a breakthrough. A genealogist named Kirsten Bergman, working at the National Institute on Genealogical Research, announced that he had identified the lost German girl. Her name was Lore Bauer, sometimes listed as Lara Bauer in different records. The research revealed that she had survived the war and the immediate aftermath. She wasn't killed in those chaotic final days, as many had assumed. Instead, she somehow found a way to rebuild her life from the ruins of 1945. Laura lived for almost 50 more years after that terrible day when the camera captured her walking down that road in Czechoslovakia. She died on October 30th, 1994, at the age of 73. She had lived through the rise and fall of Nazi Germany, the chaos of war's end, and the rebuilding of Europe. But what happened to her in those intervening decades? Did she ever marry, have children, find peace? The researchers who identified her didn't provide details about her later life. In many ways, she remained as mysterious as ever. We can only imagine what Lore's life was like after 1945. Like millions of other Germans and Austrians, she would have faced the massive challenge of rebuilding in a defeated nation. The Germany she had known was gone forever, divided between the victorious powers. For someone who had served in the German military, even as a young auxiliary helper, the post-war years would have been especially difficult. Questions about the past, about what you had done during the war, hung over an entire generation. And for a woman who had clearly suffered trauma during those final days of war, the psychological scars may have lasted a lifetime. In 1945, there was no PTSD counseling, no trauma therapy, no support systems for people who had endured what Laura experienced. She may have changed her name, moved to a different town, tried to start completely over. Many people did. The desire to escape the past, to become someone new, was overwhelming for survivors of that era. Did she ever talk about what happened to her on that road in 1945? Did she know that her image had become famous? We'll probably never know. That brief 55-second piece of footage became much more than just a historical document. It inspired filmmakers, historians, and artists. Steven Spielberg incorporated elements of Laura's story into his films about World War II. The image resonated because it showed war's impact on individuals, not just armies and nations. While history books focus on battles and strategies, Laura's story reminded viewers that war is ultimately about human suffering. She became an inadvertent spokesperson for all the unnamed victims of history. Her swollen face and traumatized expression spoke for millions of people whose stories were never recorded, whose names were never remembered. The footage also raised uncomfortable questions about war and its aftermath. What happened to Laura? Who was responsible for her injuries? And how many other young women suffered similar fates in those chaotic final days of World War II? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're important to ask. They remind us that behind every historical event are real people with real stories of loss, trauma, and survival. Laura Bauer died in 1994, almost 50 years after that American cameraman filmed her walking down a road in Czechoslovakia. She had lived through one of history's most turbulent periods and somehow found a way to survive and rebuild. Her story reminds us that history isn't just about famous leaders and major events. It's also about ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. People like Laura, who found themselves swept up in forces beyond their control. Today, when we see images of refugees fleeing conflicts around the world, we should remember the lost German girl. Her traumatized face reminds us that behind every crisis are individual human beings with their own stories of loss and survival. Laura Bauer's 15 minutes of unwanted fame came at the worst moment of her life. But perhaps that brief footage served a purpose. It preserved her story and made her a witness to history. It reminded future generations that war's true cost isn't measured in battles won or territory gained, but in human lives forever changed. She was no longer lost. She was remembered. And in being remembered, she had found a kind of immortality, not as a victim, but as a survivor who represented the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable horror.